Hi, everyone. I will just wait for a couple of minutes to have some more attendees to join. Okay, so maybe we can start and we'll see when the others will join. So, okay, thank you all for joining us today for this important event. I'm not sure you're all familiar with APAC Med and the work we do, so I will just give you a brief introduction of our work. So APAC Med is the only regional association that provides a unified voice for the medical device industry in Asia Pacific. So we have over 230 members. Majority of them are medical device companies, and they range from startups to bigger multinational companies. So this is the first time APAC Med is organizing a webinar that focuses on sustainability, and I hope it will be the start to many other initiatives. So if you're with us today, I think you already know that sustainability in the medical device industry is an increasingly important consideration for manufacturers, but also for decision makers. So, of course, sustainable technologies are better for the environment, but they can also provide you with a competitive advantage. So it's important that manufacturers think about sustainability at the beginning of the design phase of their devices. Optimizing resource efficiency in production and utilizing renewable energy sources is a good start to improve efficiency in your supply chain. So for this first webinar, opportunity and challenges in the procurement of renewable energy in Southeast Asia, I'm glad to welcome our panel of experts. So Leanne, she's a practice area leader, energy infrastructure and resources at KL Gates. Renan Coffrey is a global energy manager at Boston Scientific Corporate Facilities Group. And Valerie Choi is a senior manager at Schneider's Electric Sustainability Business Division. We are quite a small group today, so I really encourage you to make this session as interactive as possible. We're all here to learn, so please drop your questions and comments in the chat. So I will now give the floor to Valerie to start her presentation.
Thank you, Cindy. Hi, everyone. So my name is Valerie Choi. I'm from the Schneider Electric Sustainability Business, as Cindy mentioned. And specifically, I'm from the Renewable Energy Advisory Team, where we basically act as independent renewable energy advisors, so commercial advisors to global organizations in strategizing and actually procuring your renewable energy to meet your renewable energy corporate goals. Next slide, please. So I guess many of you are probably unfamiliar with us, especially if you are based in Asia. So we are actually the largest global advisor for corporate power purchase agreements around the world. And to date, we have advised on about 11,000 megawatts of wind and solar capacity for corporates across all industries. Next slide, please. So what I'm trying to show here is basically what we call a representative net zero strategic roadmap. So when a company thinks about how to reduce their emissions and get to zero emissions, there are essentially only a few main levers that can be pulled. So first of all, you want to limit your business growth, or rather the energy consumed by your business growth as much as possible. Then you would embark on energy efficiency efforts. And after you have done all you can to improve the efficiency at your facilities, I assume you would still be consuming electricity. So in order to get your electricity consumption down to zero emissions, then the only way left is to procure renewable energy, which is the topic of what we're talking about today. Next slide, please. So all companies are at different stages of the clean tech journey or the renewable energy journey. Most companies fall at the beginning of the journey and the advanced step, meaning you either have yet to properly define what your targets and your goals are and are just looking at setting the strategy, or you have started to follow a few transactions in the market and are doing some deals in some geographies, but you're not yet at really innovating real next generation solutions, which is what some of the leading companies are doing. So the leading companies would be, for example, some of the tech companies. A lot of them would fall into that category, but most companies would be at a beginning or advanced stage. Next slide, please. So before we go into what are the opportunities in Asia, and with 15 minutes, I can only talk about it at a very high level. I just want to briefly touch on what are the 3 ways that you could actually procure renewable energy. So the most effective way, which is, or rather the easiest way, is purchasing what we call energy attribute certificates, or some of you might know it as renewable energy certificates. So what these are is actually, if a solar or wind facility produces 1 megawatt hour of electricity, that then qualifies them to be that 1 megawatt hour to be registered as a certificate. And if this certificate is then bought by a third party and what we call retire in the system, then you can claim that this green energy belongs to you, and you can use it to make your environmental claims. So you can buy it on its own, which is what we call unbundled, or you could buy it with your electricity contract, which is what we refer to as bundled. The next one is probably the next option is probably something that a lot of people are very familiar with, which is doing on-site generation on your site. Could be on your roof or some of the empty land you have around your factory. So for sure, this would be a very direct way of reducing your consumption. It has high visual appeal, given that it is a system on your roof, but of course, it typically doesn't contribute more than, say, 10 to 15% of your electricity consumption. And so, which is therefore why a lot of companies prefer, in places where it is possible, to purchase off-site generation. So these are typically large-scale purchases of utility-scale solar and wind projects, where you have to enter into long-term, could be 15 to 20-year power purchase agreements with renewable energy project developers to commit to offtake the production from these projects. So this would then come delivered with the environmental attributes that you can claim for your use. But for sure, even if it is a preferred option, it is not available in every market in Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to quickly show here how offsite PPAs have proliferated across the globe. And as you can see, most of that capacity is in the Americas and in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And the reason for that is because the policies and the push for renewables there has really enabled this market to grow. So typically you will need like a deregulated or liberalized electricity market for corporate PPAs to really take hold. And which is why we don't see that much capacity growing in Asia yet, but that picture is slowly changing. Next slide, please. So this is a map of all of Asia. So if today we just zoom in on Southeast Asia, you can see that the opportunities are very varied from market to market. So the only places in Southeast Asia where you can really do an offsite power purchase agreement right now is Singapore and the Philippines. We see opportunities coming up in places like Vietnam, Malaysia, but Indonesia is a really challenging one, given that it is still a fully regulated market with no foreseeable, say, offsite PPA purchase options in the near term. Next slide, please. So as you embark on your renewable energy journey, you would have to ask yourself several questions. I think first of all is, what are your organization's goals? And then what options out there, especially those that I've just mentioned, how do they best align with your goals? And given that the markets change so quickly and that there are various options out there, how will you educate yourself and align your team and what incentives are available, if any. How should you prioritize markets and activities, and what is the industry best practice out there? Lastly, what technologies are available? For example, in a lot of Southeast Asia, we see primarily solar projects, although in places like the Philippines, wind is also a possibility. So are they viable, and has the market changed since the last time we looked at it? Because as I mentioned, electricity markets are really changing at a very rapid pace in our region. Next slide, please. So I would like to thank APAC-MED for maybe giving me a little bit of airtime to make a plug for what we call the NEO network. So NEO network stands for the New Energy Opportunity Network. And this is a platform for renewable energy buyers and sellers. It's not a matchmaking platform, but it is a community with a lot of good resources that you can tap on to try to answer, at least initially, a lot of the questions that I had posed in my previous slide. So it is completely free for a renewable energy buyer to join. And today we have over 400 buyers who are on the platform. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to sign up. And the link, I've left it down below on this slide, which will be provided afterwards. So with that, I think I'll hand over the time to Ronan. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. And good morning, everybody. I'm saying good morning because I'm presenting to you here from Ireland, and I know it's evening time for you. So, as Cindy said in the introduction, Ronan Coffey is my name. I'm energy manager with Boston Scientific. So I'm very happy to be here to present to you on our journey and specifically our experience with renewable power purchasing. So you can move to the next slide. So this slide is really a standard kind of introductory slide. It's just really to give you a sense of the global nature of Boston Scientific. We are a large medical device developer, manufacturer and seller. We are located in more than 120 countries with commercial representation in those countries. We're closing in on 40,000 employees at this point and continuing to grow. We have 178 properties or locations worldwide. 16 of those are manufacturing sites, and the remainder would be distribution or commercial properties. And important point: approximately 42% of our net sales in 2020 was outside the US. So certainly a global footprint and a global organization. So our mission and values. Our mission is Boston Scientific is dedicated to transforming lives through innovative medical solutions that improve the health of patients around the world. And our values are listed here on the right-hand side: caring, meaningful innovation, high performance, global collaboration, diversity, and winning spirit. So we can go to the next slide. So living our values, and specifically zeroing in here on protecting the environment, which is, I guess, highlighting the area that we're focusing on and talking about today. We have a carbon neutrality commitment for our manufacturing and key distribution sites. I'll talk a little more about that in the coming slides. More recently, in September 2021, we committed to setting science-based targets and setting a net zero target by 2050. So quite ambitious goals, and as I say, I'll talk to those in a little more detail in the coming slides. So next slide. It's good to just, I guess, ground everybody when we talk about emissions. And apologies, many people on the call may be very, very familiar with this, but this is a standard language around greenhouse gas emissions, and it's, I guess, an internationally accepted definition or classification of greenhouse gas emissions as per the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And it splits emissions into three scopes: scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 being direct emissions, which would typically be from combustion within your property. And for Boston Scientific, that generally means natural gas that we burn in our boilers to heat our buildings. It would also include diesel generators and even company-owned vehicles. Scope 2 then is indirect emissions, which is generally from electricity that we purchase, and will be from the generation of that electricity, although it's remote to our sites and remote to the location that we use electricity. We are responsible for the emissions associated with that generation, and that is our Scope 2 emissions. And then Scope 3 is value chain emissions. So it's, I think of it as everything beyond the four walls of our properties. It's things to do with business travel, employee commuting, the goods and the services that we purchase to manufacture our products, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very, very broad category. And on the bottom here, just to show that in 2017, we made the commitment for carbon neutrality that was boundaried on Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that was really bringing it into our energy world. It was emissions predominantly associated with our energy use. And then, as I mentioned earlier, last year, we complemented that by adding a commitment around science-based targets, joining the race to zero, effectively net zero by 2050. So next slide, please. So when I talk about carbon neutrality, GEMS is really how we deliver carbon neutrality, and GEMS stands for Global Energy Management System, which we describe in the Parthenon. It's a vision supported by strategies based on foundations. So this is really just putting a structure around how we manage energy globally to address the challenge of, a multinational corporation with locations in different climates, manufacturing different products, different types of buildings. All of that is a challenge. So to try and put a structure around that, we developed GEMS and we described it in the Parthenon. And the goal for GEMS then is the carbon neutrality. It's to achieve carbon neutrality for Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030. Part of GEMS then, and one of the key pillars, is the strategy to get us to carbon neutrality. And we call that C-cubed, which is cut, convert, and compensate. And this really talks about putting primary focus on energy efficiency. And I think that's really important. So our the best kilowatt hour and the best ton of carbon is the one we don't use or don't emit. That's our view. So we put a lot of focus on being efficient around energy use. The second C is for convert. So, while focusing on efficiency, we also look to switch away from fossil fuel sources towards renewable sources. And finally, compensate. So for remaining emissions that we haven't been able to cut or convert, we do allow ourselves to address those remaining emissions through carbon offsets or carbon credits. What's important here is the strategy is, we feel it's carbon neutrality is the right thing to do, and C-cubed is the right way to do it. However, we complement the goal with interim goals, and these are pretty important because, as well as setting the goal for carbon neutrality, at the same time we said, right, we're going to set goals around renewable electricity and renewable energy total. So we set a goal of 50% renewable electricity by 2021, 100% renewable electricity by 2024, and then 90% renewable energy, all sources, by 2027. And by all sources, we mean electricity plus natural gas plus any other form of energy source. And what these interim goals are doing is forcing us into what I would call deep decarbonization. It allows us not to address too much of our emissions in compensate. So we simply can't just write a check, buy carbon credits, and achieve carbon neutrality. We actually need to make real change in our energy sources, and that's driving us into the topic we're talking about today, which is the whole procurement of renewable energy. So those interim goals are very important. So next slide, please. At the beginning of the journey, having set the goals and having figured out our strategy, the next step was to engage with someone with expertise in the space. So we started to work with Schneider to figure out what our global energy and emissions profile looked like, and then to understand what are the renewable options available to us in those locations. And as Valerie mentioned in her presentation, we began to understand the various renewable energy mechanisms available to us, whether they be purchasing attributes, energy attribute certificates, doing supplier deals, doing on-site renewables or off-site renewable generation. So with this approach, then we were able to, and Schneider were able to build us a blended roadmap that showed us a ramp to achieving our goals. This is really important. So this essentially all distilled into an opportunity list, and we started to work on those opportunities then, and we're continuing to work on them right to today. So I guess summarizing our approach, having assessed our load, having understood our options, our approach here was to maximize on-site renewable generation where possible, pursue long-term off-site renewable procurement through power purchase agreements, and then almost as a bridge or in the interim or where long-term off-site deals didn't make sense, purchase green tariffs or energy attribute certificates as required. So next slide. And this just shows, I guess, what we call a ramp to carbon neutrality. It helps to show the trajectory of our emissions, where we've come from. I mean, we go back to 2013, we were at, I think, around about 125,000 tons of carbon, and the vast majority of that was from the electricity, so it was scope 2 emissions. And through the work we've been doing, we've been able to make serious progress in reducing our scope 2 emissions. And the broken line then shows the ramp up in renewables that is achieving that decarbonisation for us. And it is a blend of those power purchase agreements, on-site renewables, supplier renewables, and renewable energy credit purchases. Something that's interesting, and we're seeing, I would say, is a challenge, but we're putting a lot of focus on now, and that is decarbonisation of our natural gas consumption. And it's certainly not as straightforward as electricity. So effectively what we're doing in a lot of our locations is switching our heating source from natural gas to electricity, often called electrification. So that's really moving our emissions from scope 1 into scope 2, which, and the effect of that is, it means that we actually are going to need more power purchase agreements, more on-site renewables, more energy attribute purchases. So next slide. Yeah, and again, just hitting on the three mechanisms we are using currently, and key points on those. I mean, supplier green tariffs, we see those as being a very useful bridge to a long-term arrangement, particularly in Europe. So we're in the process of negotiating a long-term power purchase agreement to meet our European load. But in the interim, we've entered into supplier green deals with our utility companies that I would say are allowing us to meet our goals, but we wouldn't necessarily be satisfied with those as long-term arrangements. We want to slide in a power purchase agreement and replace those with that. They're certainly easy to implement, do come at a cost premium, and that's a consideration. On-site or distributed generation, Valerie mentioned this, and I'm glad our figures are aligned, because our experience says that for our sites, typically between 10 and 15% is the maximum we can get. In exceptional circumstances, if we have extra land bank available, we may be able to push that towards 20%, but typically that would be the max we would get from an on-site solar install. We typically, for on-site generation, prefer to go the third-party owned route. So we don't like to invest capital. We typically would pay a third party to install solar on our roof, and we would purchase the outputs of the system from them. We have 3 existing systems in the US and Puerto Rico. We have 2 that are actively in construction or planned for construction, and we have 4 more in feasibility. So we have a nice pipeline of on-site projects happening there. In terms of off-site, we see off-site in the form of power purchase agreements as high impact in terms of the scale, and also in terms of the solidity of the renewable claims that it allows us to make. They are complex, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. They can potentially be cost beneficial, or at least cost neutral, which is a positive. The current status, we're actively negotiating both in the US and in Europe at the moment, and we're at early stages of feasibility assessment in Ireland. So next slide. Some considerations for power purchase agreements, and I won't talk through all of this, but I just tried to summarize in the panel on the left, and it's not an exhaustive list, but for us stepping into this space, it was very new territory. We hadn't experience of negotiating long-term deals like this, and I grouped the considerations under 3 categories, really. So there's the novelty aspect, the fact that so much of this is new. Then there's the complexity of it, and then there's risk. And again, I'm not going to go through all of the items on this list, but I think just trying to paint the picture that there's a lot of new things to get your head around when negotiating a PPA. On the right, I've shown the Boston Scientific project team. So we're in a fortunate position that we have a lot of internal expertise that we can reach out to. And it became very much a cross-functional team. We needed to rely on treasury, finance, sourcing, accounting, our internal legal folks, our communications folks even. We needed to also bring in outside counsel, because we found that organizations, even the size of Boston Scientific, we don't carry the legal expertise to negotiate these type of deals. They're very nuanced, and it's a particular expertise. And in the center then, engaging with a consultant or someone who has experience in this space, and I can tell you we work closely with Schneider on these. It's vital, because you need that experience, you need that guidance, and that has been very, very important to us. So a key takeaway from this slide really is that, for an offsite power purchase agreement, cross-functional team combined with external expertise is critical. And that is my lot. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Leanne.
Many thanks, Ronan. Thank you also to APACNet and Cindy for inviting me to join this panel with Valerie and Ronan. Next slide, please. So maybe a quick introduction of K&L Gates. I'm a partner in this firm. It's an international firm with about 46 offices globally and 1,800 lawyers. The name Gates comes from Bill Gates of Microsoft father, who was one of the founder partner of the firm. Next slide, please. We are ranked well for our work, recognized for our skill sets. Next slide, please. And also in the corporate PPA as well as renewable energy work, we are known for our work. Next slide, please. And these are some of our renewable energy corporate PPA clients that we have been working for globally. Next slide, please. It's a quick introduction. So I'm a partner in our Singapore office. So from the Singapore office, it's a hub for our work in Southeast Asia and also in North Asia. Next slide, please. So again, some relevant accolades, which I'm going to skip through. Next slide, please. Yeah, so you've heard from Valerie and Ronan about how you can achieve your renewable energy goal. And one of it is to purchase, green certificates. They're officially known as EACs, Energy Attribute Certificate. As you heard from Valerie, is really a measure of 1 megawatt hour of renewable power generated. But I think very importantly, it has to be delivered to the grid in order to satisfy the requirement to be an EAC. And there are various systems globally, so they are known under different names, but they are the same thing. Next slide, please. So the other way that both Valerie and Ronan mentioned, how you can get your renewable energy source is to develop your own generation capacity, whether it's on-site, next to your factory, or off-site, either on your own, which is very unlikely for most corporate clients and purchasers. They tend to buy from a third party that develops the off-site generation. So I put this slide up. This is something that we have prepared for our client who was looking to invest and develop a solar project in Taiwan. But essentially, the issues and the risk are quite similar across Southeast Asia and, in fact, many jurisdictions. For example, in terms of the land risk, it's not all the time. Well, land is scarce. I mean, example Singapore, right? But then there's also in a lot of jurisdiction issue about overlapping land titles, duplicate land titles, and mixing land titles. And one of the other restrictions is that in some countries, foreign investors are limited in their ability to purchase land, or sometimes they can buy, but not owning a freehold. Environmental and planning, a very key issue, obviously, in order to meet the renewable energy requirements. So looking at whether your environmental impact assessment will need to be done, when do you need it to be done, how long it takes, and usually it takes a long time. Grid connection, a very key item as well, because until and unless it's connected to the grid, it's unlikely you will be able to get to your EACs. There are some issues in some countries about being able to connect to the grid and when you can do so. Construction and operation, key risk, especially during the construction period. Until and unless the construction is completed, there's no revenue to be generated from the plant. So it is a very important risk to manage, and most of the time you manage it by entering into a lump sum turnkey contract for that. Offtake arrangement, if you have an on-site facility selling the electricity and all that to your own facility, a captive plant, not be that much of an issue. But a lot of the facilities are connected to the grid. And so the off-taker will be usually the state utility, and they more or less tell you what your terms and conditions are. The good news is that in some of these countries in the region, the power purchase agreement with the state utility is quite mature. A lot of the banks are very familiar with that, and they can accept the risk. So that brings me very nicely to investment/financing. Again, there are some issues that need to be considered, but I think the good news is that there are a lot of banks, as well as sovereign wealth fund, family offices who are willing to look at funding environmentally friendly projects and renewable projects. Lastly, some of the other risks will be things like political risks, whether there be change of policy because of a change in government, expropriation risk, whether your currency, US dollar, can be convertible. But I think all of this you're pretty familiar with. Next slide, please. So whether you end up with your own on-site or off-site generation facility, or you have a virtual or synthetic power purchase agreement, one of the key agreements that you end up signing is still this PPA. As you heard from both Valerie and Ronan, you can customize it. It's bespoke. You can meet, match your consumption profile, your sustainability targets, and risk appetite. Corporate PPAs have been proven to be very constructive in the energy transition space to displace fossil fuels and encourage new and bigger renewable plants. So it's very much welcome. And as Barry mentioned, there are basically 3 types of PPAs. So we have the direct one, the retail, and the virtual. Next slide, please. So I will quickly touch on some of the common terms and conditions for a virtual power purchase agreement. Capacity is one of the starting things that you'll see in the VPPA. Talks about what is the nameplate capacity, that's the planned design capacity. Minimum installed, you need to have, I'm just going to talk from the viewpoint of the buyer. So as a buyer, you want to ensure that whichever project that you invest in, as a buyer of the VPPA, that is going to be a minimum installed capacity. You may want to have a maximum as well, so that your exposure is limited, especially if you contract to buy all or a certain percentage of the installed quantity. Quantities come into play, as I mentioned just now, about how much you're going to end up paying to the seller. Next slide, please. Which then comes into the pricing issue. The virtual power purchase agreement or the synthetic power purchase agreement is really a floating versus fixed price swap. So the seller is going to be the fixed price payer, and you as the buyer will be paying the market price. And so the delta, the difference will be then paid by either party depending how the price move. And the rest of the definition really relates to the calculation of that amount that either party ends up paying to the other. Next slide, please. So term, as Valerie and Ronan mentioned, these agreements are long-term, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, depending on the project. But it is a pillar to a lot of the bankability and viability of this type of renewable projects. So banks who are lending to the projects will look at the VPPAs very carefully to make sure that there is sufficiently long-term and that the seller who they are lending to is going to be sufficiently taken care of in terms of risk and managing their risk well, etc., etc. And the term is long enough to cover repayment of the loan at the very least. COD, commercial operation date, is a key concept in the VPPA. That is the point in time when the payment under sale and purchase of the EACs gets triggered under the PPA. Usually you have a target COD, and there's any failure to meet by the seller, and the failure is not excused, there will be liquidated damages payable, and sometimes you may have a guaranteed COD, which is a long stop date. And a failure to meet that long stop date means that you as the buyer has the option to terminate without any penalty, but it still doesn't address your problem of then not having the renewable credits that you wanted from this project. But that's another issue that has to be dealt with outside of the PPA. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide I have, and it talks about the VPPA will talk about the independent system operator, ISO, basically manage the grid, and an entity that the seller will deal with a lot. I want to focus on the performance assurance. We typically see that both the buyer and sellers are required to put in some performance assurance, credit enhancement. Typically, although as you seen from my slide as well as Valerie's slide, and of course Ronan from Boston Scientific, buyers tend to be very strong corporates, and you wonder why performance assurance is required. That's because when they deal with the PPA, they are not doing it through the HQ, but they're actually dealing it through the a subsidiary. So sometimes we run into a credit standing issue, and a credit enhancement will be required. Next slide, please. So that's all I have. And what we have next is a Q&A session. So maybe let me invite back Valerie and Ronan to join me for this Q&A session. So I have a couple of questions that's sent. I think let's start with the open one that's in the Q&A. So the question is, what frameworks or agreements are needed across ASEAN to make energy sharing possible easier between the local market? There was a question posed to the policymakers and legal community watching this webinar. So maybe let me get started on this, since that legal bit, I fit within that. I think interestingly, Singapore has started a pilot to import renewable energy by submarine cables. And the first project is already underway, in the sense that the subsea cables are being built and all that, importing renewable energy from Malaysia. So there are plans to import it from Indonesia, and we've seen some players positioning themselves for that. In terms of what is needed, I think there were talks, aside from the physical infrastructure, which is very, very important and the most expensive bit. The agreements would be things like, ability to have open access. I will invite Valerie and Ronan for their thoughts after this. But in my view, we need to have a framework of similar or harmonizing the technical requirements, but also open access, and also sharing of cost, I think, to develop the Trans-ASEAN grid, which people have been talking about for the longest time I can remember, but we haven't got very far on that. I think the most advanced more like export and / import is really Laos and Thailand in terms of renewable. The Nam Tune and all that, the hydropower, huge for many years, but that is actually very controversial because Mekong River and all that stuff. So with that, maybe I pass it to Valerie for her views.
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. I think I would answer this primarily from a corporate buyer's angle, right? So when you are a corporate renewable energy buyer, presumably you're doing so because you're reporting to some of the global sustainability reporting frameworks like CDP, like RE100, science-based targets. So within these frameworks, there exists the definition of a market boundary. So a market boundary is typically defined by the country's boundaries. The only exception for that is in Europe, where the grids are working somewhat in tandem, and also in North America. So there are, in order for two different markets. So in this case, let's visualize Thailand and Malaysia. If you want Thailand and Malaysia to be considered a single market in the eyes of these sustainability reporting bodies, then need to exist not only a physical interconnection, but the markets also have to demonstrate a high degree of synchronization in their electricity market operations. And if those who are familiar with the situation in our region, I think you would agree with me that that is very unlikely to happen, right? In the short to medium term. So I think then in that case, and one might ask, why do these rules exist? And the reason why these rules exist is to basically encourage renewable energy penetration in every country. Because if we take the Malaysia and Thailand example again, if Malaysia allows, say, offsite PPAs to happen, but not in Thailand, but yet they are considered a single market, what you would find is everybody building projects in Malaysia, potentially overloading that grid with a lot of intermittent renewable energy resources that are not even for consumption there. And on the other hand, Thailand policymakers will not have any incentive to actually allow, to deregulate the market and allow corporate PPAs. So that's the reason for the market boundary definition. Which then brings me to the point that as a corporate buyer, you probably should look to helping to encourage, say, local governments to allow corporate PPAs in market, rather than have any illusions about potential ASEAN grid being able to solve the market boundary issues in the short to medium term. Ronan, do you have anything you would like to add to that?
No, not a lot, because Valerie covered, I think, all the main points from a buyer's perspective. And obviously, I'm not familiar with the Asian grid framework, but you know, the boundary issue, and you know, it's been very important for us to understand, you know, particularly in the US, for example, where our projects can be located versus where our load is located, and having, you know, having that sense of what is the entire grid, and what, you know, what can we do within that grid. And even in Europe, you know, being able to do projects in mainland Europe that are allowing us to meet our goals from an Irish load perspective is very important. So aligning to those CDP RE100 reporting boundaries is very important.
Many thanks, Ronan. Actually, there's another question that I think specifically for you. Just to, you know, it's actually quite related to what we've been discussing. So it says that, you know, what are Boston Scientific's plans to meet their renewable energy goals in the APAC region? Yeah,
good question. So currently we have, I would say, it's a modest manufacturing presence. We in Southeast Asia, we've got, it's a pretty large manufacturing plant, but it's just one. And given, you know, the maturity of the PPA market, and also the fact that our load is quite small, I don't think we'll be doing anything offsite in the short term. But if our presence grows, and our footprint grows, I think we will then look to do something offsite. But for the short term, we're focusing on an on-site solution complemented with renewable attribute purchases, or EAC purchases, to meet our goals.
Right. Okay, many thanks. Valerie, there's a few questions for you, but maybe let me start with one that kind of tie in with what Ronan is saying. It says that which markets in Southeast Asia excite you the most, and which ones worry you the most?
Yeah, thanks for that. I would say a lot of markets in Southeast Asia really get me worried. But let me start with the good stuff. I think especially with the imports, right, that you mentioned, to Singapore, I think that's a very uplifting development. If you notice that also doesn't solve the market boundary issue yet, depending on, you know, where it comes from, because if it's coming from a third country, it's not considered within the Singapore market boundary. But we are hoping that there might be an update to the rules to allow that, because Singapore is a unique situation where it's not that the country as a whole hasn't looked at renewable energy solutions, is that we are just too small, right, for there to ever be enough. So I think for sure Singapore is very exciting. Malaysia, if you've you know, paid attention, they actually launched a renewable energy roadmap for the country around about Christmas, and in it they mentioned corporate PPAs many times, and we know that there are mechanisms that has been talked about for a while. We just need to make sure that you know, we're just waiting for the policymakers to enable that to happen on a more broader scale. In terms of countries that worry me the most, I would say honestly it would be Indonesia and Thailand, because this is where a lot of corporates have really large facilities, and therefore the need to decarbonize. But there really isn't a way for corporates to access renewable energy at scale, except purchasing of certificates, which, to be honest, doesn't add new renewable energy capacity to the grid when you purchase those. So for corporates that are concerned about obtaining high quality renewable energy, actually making an impact, then these two markets are rather worrying, because they are regulated, and there are no indications that you know, the policy will change in the near term.
Right. Okay. Many thanks. Can I just talk a bit about Singapore? I just want to ask you on this renewable energy import for Singapore. I read the guide published by EMA in November. It doesn't really talk about this, or at least the impression I got, maybe because the report was so brief, the guide was so brief, it didn't talk about reporting requirements and all that. It seems pretty relaxed about it, which then sort of like struck me as a energy security / option to, a widening the option rather than complying with some of this international standard seems. So, and then the other thing I hope you can elaborate is, what about Cambodia and Laos? Yeah.
Yeah, no, very good question. So, and actually very timely, because I actually just had a conversation with EMA yesterday about this this tender that they have, and you're absolutely right. So if you think of EMA's position, they are an energy regulator. So for those who are not aware of the Singapore acronyms, EMA stands for the Energy Market Authority, which is the energy regulator in Singapore. So the tender for the rights to basically import electricity in Singapore is governed by them. And because they're an energy regulator, certainly their primary concern is about energy security, bringing other sources of energy into Singapore, diversification of those sources. So helping corporates to meet their goals and making sure that the correct reporting and done all that are secondary concerns. And then with respect to Cambodia and Laos, I believe Laos has IREX. I'm not entirely sure. Don't take my word for it. But not in Cambodia. And so you can do on-site solar for sure. You can do on-site solar wherever you have a roof, I suppose. But it's, again, these are regulated electricity markets, and there just isn't sufficient reason for the market to liberalize. So if you look at the reasons for why markets liberalize, is because consumers, there's sufficient consumers, like industrial consumers with demands for more competitive sources of power. So when those pressures don't exist, then there's often no reason to go down that path.
Many thanks, Valerie. Which is then, there's a question for Ronan, and I think that's actually tied in with what Valerie is talking about. So the question is, why is renewable energy an important element of any decarbonization strategy? Because I think, we need to convince the government, right, as Valerie said, to do this stuff.
Yeah, I think, we all see now that, commitments around climate and around decarbonization are growing. And we saw a huge increase in that around COP26, late last year. What's also happening is increased scrutiny of some of those commitments, and to look at what actual programs and what initiatives companies are putting in place to achieve decarbonization. And I think increasingly it's frowned upon, if you like, that companies will just rely on purchasing carbon offsets to meet any kind of neutrality goal. So, a decarbonization program has to really contain, for me anyway, 3 elements. It has to focus on efficiency, it has to focus on renewable energy, and then allow a certain amount of carbon offsetting, because that's probably unavoidable. But real and what we call deep decarbonization is just changing the source of your energy. That really is a fundamental part of any decarbonization goal, and that's why a renewables program is really, really strong and very, very important.
Right. Okay. So what are your key first steps then for you to build a renewable energy program? I mean, you mentioned in your slide before, that you got Snyder to help you look at what you have, your carbon footprint, and then so I just want to hear from you, what are the key first steps?
Yeah, and I think, and Valerie showed a nice slide with the roadmap, and I think her first signpost on that roadmap would sum up what I would see as the key points as well, which are First of all, establishing your footprint. You know, what is the scale of your energy use and where is it located, and what are the emissions associated with that energy use? Because we know that grids have different carbon intensities in different regions. So understanding all of that and understanding your footprint, and then setting a goal is the most important thing, because you know, jumping in without any kind of a North Star of a goal that you need to get to is going to be overwhelming. So I think having that and that goal approved at the top level of your organization is absolutely critical, because all activity must point towards that. And then it's really, you know, working with an external expert in this. It can be Schneider. I know there's others in the space, but our experience with Schneider has been very positive. So it's working with someone who has the experience to help you understand what the options are, and even understand the various renewable mechanisms that are open to you, and what blend of those is going to work for you in each region that your load is located.
Right. Many thanks. There's a last question, so I think we have 4 minutes left. So I will pass it to Valerie for this question. What does one need to look out for when buying EACs or RECs from a third-party supplier?
I think when you buy EACs, you have to make sure, first of all, that they are from acceptable accreditation bodies. So in this part of Southeast Asia, we're talking primarily IREX and Tigers. So these are international standards that are accepted by the likes of RE100 and CDP. And then you've also got to make sure that, so a very important step in purchasing certificates is a step that we call retirement. So unless you have your own, you maintain your own accounts with these different standards, then invariably the supplier would have to retire it in the system for you, and then issue what we call a redemption statement, a proof that they have done it with a QR code and all that. And the reason why that is important is that without this retirement step, the EACs can continue to be sold to any number of parties. And so therefore there would be double, triple counting and all sorts of greenwashing going on. So that is really important. Another thing that I find is very prevalent in our region that I would need to highlight is when it comes to using third parties and power purchase agreements for on-site solar projects, you would find that when you try to get a lower price from a third party, so a lower power purchase price, right? So basically you get them to invest in a system on your roof, and in turn you buy the energy from them. So this is what we call a power purchase agreement. So when you try to negotiate them down on price, and if they're willing to give you a better rate, you really have to doubt whether or not they took away the ability for you to own those environmental attributes. Often I've seen in contracts where such practices happen in Southeast Asia, especially because I think developers are aware that there are buyers who are not so well versed with these contracts, is that they would essentially mention that the ownership belongs to them in a contract, and then you know how problematic that is. So if they have ownership of the attributes, they could sell it to somebody else. So what that means is, even if the roof is on, even if the system is on your roof, that green energy does not belong to you. So, yeah.
Right, many thanks. So all you get is the electron without being given credit for it being a renewable energy source that you are using, right?
Yes.
Yeah. No, and we also come across the situation where it's not clear, but I think slowly people are recognizing it, where it's not clear whether the IPPs, independent power producers, the developers that develop all this renewable energy actually are able, have the legal standing to sell the EACs, or that still belong to the state utility. So that's something that we still have to struggle with. So yeah, Cindy, time's up exactly at 6 Singapore time. So turning it back to you. And before I do that, thank you so much, Valerie and Ronan, for being such great panelists.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, right on time. So I would just like to address as well a real big thank you to our speaker, speakers for this session and kicking off this new initiative. This topic is new to me, so I definitely learned a lot, and I hope our attendees too. So as mentioned, this is a new initiative on sustainability, so I would be glad to connect with our attendees afterwards and see if there's any way for us to work together as an industry. So you have my email on the screen. So if you'd like to know more on this initiative or other future initiatives, you can feel free to connect with me as well if you have any questions that you would like to send to our speakers. Yeah, so thank you again to all of you to join. Thank you for your time, and I hope to see you during our next events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.